And thanks for joining us on this episode of the Fat Pitch Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Paul Borowski, Chief Distribution Officer of Sealy Investment Securities, and I'm joined by my co-host, Clint Sorensen from Wealth Shield. Clint, why don't you tell everyone who this week's guest is?
Yeah, this is awesome. This is one I've been looking forward to just because of everything going on in AI, everything, the D's we talk about, decentralization, deglobalization, decarbonization, but the most important D, which is data. So we've got Alexander McCaig here to talk to us about why the fat pitch is in data and in particular data ownership. So Alexander, welcome to the Fat Pitch Podcast and thanks for joining.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate you having me on, and pretty sharp of you to be talking about data itself. It's going to be the fundamental for society for a long time going forward. And our key is going to be figuring out how is it that we're going to use it properly to continue to evolve the systems we have in place. So I'm very happy to talk about it today.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. And kudos, nobody listens to this in live time, but here the three of us are committed to hearing about data on the Friday before a long July 4th holiday. I think you're out in Santa Fe, Alexander.
Yes, I am. Clint, beautiful Santa Fe.
I'm in Dallas, so we've all chosen to stay inside in air conditioning too. Some data I don't want. But I'd love to learn more about kind of your origin story, right?
Sure.
How you ended up where you are now.
Yeah, most definitely. And I will grace this with, when we think about how we develop systems, for many people out there, we have basic skills and half-decent thought processes. And if you apply hard work to that and a little bit of luck, and, being at the right place at the right time, things start to evolve naturally on their own, and it cascades into something you're like, wow, this has turned into a thing that is actually going to be, helping people or, other systems, depending on what you design it for. So many moons ago, back around 2015, there was a lot going on with things like Cambridge Analytica, the Experian, hack, stuff like that. And there was brief sprinklings about how data was being used and essentially lost because there was bad regulation around how people were storing, data as a thing, this intangible thing, and how companies were really using it to understand people like Paul or Clint and what is the profile of them? Like, how does their identity, mirror what they do in their day-to-day life? And back during that time, my background's in finance, so a good friend of mine, Jonathan Schellen, and we share the same alma mater, but many different years apart from when we graduated. I care to say that he's probably the more handsome of the two and probably more intelligent, but I'm just a good hard worker over here. So we were sitting around and we were in New York City and we were in a steakhouse. And at that time, I did eat meat. I'm currently a vegan now. Data, right, leads me down the path to making other decisions. And there were some issues that we, both in a, what I would say, a larger, more giving back sense wanted to solve. And we saw that many of the people who participate in the global economy, about 60% of them, don't have access to specific financial products. They don't have access to bank accounts. They don't have the proper paperwork. They don't have the things that allow them to be a part of the things which we are so accustomed to here in our Western developed, society itself. Is that making sense so far?
Yeah.
And I'll show you how this rounds around towards data. And please stop me because I can monologue all day long. Now, we're discussing, and, I was writing some papers at the time just essentially on the interconnectedness between all these different nodes which made up the system and where things kind of fell off and where regulation falls short of allowing people to participate in this thing that allows us to essentially thrive over here and live a rather fine material existence. And so Jonathan and I were in discussion. We're looking around at this steakhouse in just out of Rockefeller Square, and everybody was on their phone. Well, first of all, it's a travesty because, when you're out to lunch, you should be having a nice social conversation over a good meal, but everybody had their heads buried in these devices.
That's a lost art.
Yeah.
Lost art.
And we're kind of bringing it back here in a special medium, right? But yeah, within that lost art, we were discussing these disparities in the global financial system. And I was like, hey, well, what about the thought of underwriting people on their data? I said, it's all well and good that you can collateralize assets, right? To say that, if I want to take out a loan, well, what do I have to essentially, put up against that risk if I'm the bank or the underwriter itself? And for many people, if you want them to participate, they don't have cars, they don't have heavy material assets, they don't have a portfolio of these things. But what they do have is information, which they're generating in droves. And at that time, there's about 3.4 billion smartphones on the planet. And people in the poorest nations do have access to them, and they'll charge their phones over at specific city shops or off, commercial light poles, whatever it might be, just to make sure that they're on the grid. And it was something that was very pervasive. So it's like, how do you use the power of that to benefit people, to drive them into this system where they can participate in the global economy? And so we're like, well, let's underwrite them on the data that they're creating. Let's allow them to use that to get access to financial products. Awesome idea. Great. Why don't we do that? And then wait a minute, hold the phone. We got a problem. How do we know how much this data is worth? Is it like a truckload? Like, what does an asset look like? Where's the limitations on it? How do you define how much and what the price is? How fungible this object could be? And what's the value to the people who are doing the underwriting? And so when we looked at that and realized that, truly when it comes down to the behavior, the thought processes, the emotions, perspectives, and feelings of a human being, that could be tremendously valuable for understanding their flows and really de-risking that person if you were to lend them something. Because essentially, Paul, over time, this is my first time meeting you, but over time, I developed data through a relationship with you. My mind's composing that, my feelings, my emotions. And so the next time I engage, it's like, this relationship I have with you, Paul, is quite trustworthy. And I'd be willing to do things that I otherwise wouldn't do right out of the gate with you, unless, I'm not that averse to risk and I'll do anything under the sun, bet the long horse, right? So with that, we realized we needed to create a technology that took data, which people were generating in droves, and turned it into something that was packaged, fungible, secure, and had the ability to transfer itself peer-to-peer instantaneously and appropriate a value to it. And so what we found is that we created a marketplace technology that allowed normal people all over the world to freely participate in taking their data down off the internet and putting new data into this thing, which was a data vault. So in order for us to get to that point, go ahead.
Did you say a data vault?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure.
That's correct. So much like you think about like with a bank and you're storing your assets in it, take that same perspective in a very intangible notion of being online and you start storing your information. And then you can pick and choose when to withdraw those things and use it essentially as payment, right? I'll share this to you and you can give me something in return. And now what we found is that by taking this step back, it unlocked a world of possibilities for how this data can be used and removing those silos around where data was sitting. And if you can channel that down to the core person who's generating it, it reduces the frictions and flow of information so that society, systems, enterprises can take this and make better decisions and do a lot less guesswork. You guys following me on this?
Yeah, very much so. And so one of the questions that comes to mind to me is creating essentially, I'm going to use the term product for lack of better vernacular.
Sure.
The query that always comes to my head is how do you find value, right? The old saying is something's worth what the market will bear.
Sure.
So in this infancy of this thought process you had, is it a value discovery?
Yeah,
as you put that data out there in the early stage, obviously then it matures, markets become more efficient. But it sounds to me, if I'm understanding, Clint knows you mentioned I was in the half of the class that made the top half possible when I went.
You were the base supporting them,
Yes, I am helping them achieve greater soar. So I'd be very curious, since you clearly were at the onslaught of this. All we heard about was, hey, Cambridge Analytica's convincing Brexit and Trump and everything else. But you, on the other hand, were out there looking to create a market for this data. Am I early on? How do you find the value?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for so long, companies were mining tons and tons of data, and they weren't truly sure what to do with it. And the most powerful things in the world are the things that actually control people. And if you can control them in droves through behavior, I mean, what better technological weapon in warfare to use than data itself? No, why launch a missile when you can get people to eat themselves alive? So that model of data aggregation and analysis turned into something of a coercion-based system, right? Where you're using that to drive people in their behaviors without them knowing it.
Yes.
Now, the technology we designed flips that thing on its head and turns data into a needs-based model where people are defining themselves and telling others what they need. And so then the market can meet them with the proper products and services to match essentially where those gaps are and better understand us, as a society or, what we're voting on or anything of the sort. And you had asked about price discovery.
Yeah.
So why would anyone pay for something that they would seemingly be getting for free before, right? I mean, we're stealing it, so why would we pay for it? We got a great business. This is fantastic. It's like the IRS, you know? So if we take this a step further here.
The IRS.
Yeah, so if we take it, sorry, I have no political views. This is just talking about.
We are apolitical.
Yeah, this is just objective observation here, folks. So if I'm looking at the aspects of this here in this system, how do we get people to pay for it? Well, the troves of this data that were being, essentially aggregated and stored and put into algorithms to say, this is what I think Paul is like. And if I do a couple of these tweaks or show him something, it may nudge him behaviorally in a certain direction. And if you nudge people half a degree, but do it very often, they find themselves on a totally different path than what they otherwise would have been taking. Okay. But that's all historical information. And these algorithms were taking these best guessed approaches. And this was essentially the auspices of machine learning and deep neural networks themselves, which is saying, let's take a bunch of inputs, a bunch of weights, a bunch of biases, and we're going to say that this is how a human operates. And depending on the data they put online, we're going to predict that this is the outcome they're going to end up at. Okay. And we want to drive that outcome. And that's where the coercion-based model comes in. But what if we could continue to refine this into the future and make it totally needs-based, where I know exactly what people's intentions are in the future? So rather than collecting data in the past, which is 50% of what's going on, let me take something real time and all the intention of where someone is headed, and then measure the delta between that. And then that's where the value sits. That's where the market gets made. That's why companies, when they were seemingly getting all this stuff for free, still come to us and say, hey, can you help us get something directly from people to let us know where the future is headed rather than us guessing about it?
Right.
It reminds me of The Social Experiment. If you watch that movie, when they said, if it's free, you're the product. Well, the product was the data, right? They're stealing, to borrow Alexander's term, stealing data from people to manipulate them into transacting, right? Or using the platform or whatever.
The transaction would be to buy the new irons because you'll hit the ball 20 yards further, or to vote to leave the EU. It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
For an Alexander's example, eat yourself. I'm going to tell you, Alexander, I think you'll like this quote. You might use it. The late, great Jim Morrison of The Doors said, "He who controls the media controls the mind."
Yes.
He could have added for today social media. And he would have been as articulate as he was in the 70s when he said
or
that.
The data, more importantly.
It's funny that
it's he who controls the data, because back then that's all you had was major media.
That's correct.
When he wrote that quote, which has always stuck with me, and I think you've advanced it to data.
I love the whole idea of flipping that on its head, right? And that's what you said earlier. If you think about that comment, if it's free, you're the product. What you're doing is you're essentially giving data ownership to the individual, which is like the purest form of decentralization that I can think of. And that's what excites me the most about what you're doing, because I think ultimately you have to have this collision course, right? AI is going to gobble up so much data. It's going to if you just think about from a supply and demand perspective, that demand is going to be exponential, and that supply, right, is going to get more valuable, or at least it should. I mean, I'm throwing traditional economics out the window lately, but I think that's at least that's what should work
Adam
out.
Smith is rolling over in his grave every time you talk.
That's right.
So,
but, I mean, is that kind of what you're doing, right? If you think about it, that's such a beautiful thing, in my opinion. But, if you don't mind, elaborate on that.
Yeah, you're exactly correct. And I would say that in a way, shape, or form, I'm not personally doing it. What we did is we created a technology that allows the world to do it themselves. And I think there's a foundational change that's going to happen with society, especially in a Web3 world, where we become a little bit more self-responsible for many of the things we're generating, right? I think thematically, if we look at when we were going through the Manhattan Project, I'm going to take you a little bit through history and, human evolution here. When we first realized that there was a ton of energy in a fission process from splitting an atom, we were like, let's put that thing in a bomb, right? It's like, come on, guys. I'm like, are you serious? Is this the first thing we jump to? You know, like, gosh, could we be any more unevolved with our processes here? So barbaric. And then, things evolve and the world and, technology becomes a little bit more delicate and intangible. It's not so brutish and straightforward. And with the development of these new things around AI has been around for quite some time. So, gosh, there's so much to get into here. I'm going to walk you through it, and then I will answer the questions.
Just roll.
Yeah, no problem.
Get in the flow.
So I nerd out about this one specific object. So I like to fly. I'm a little bit of a pilot here, and there's probably something I'll never have the opportunity to fly unless I was some ridiculous billionaire. But it's the SR-71 Blackbird. So Lockheed Martin designed this thing in 1962 with a slide rule. All well and good. Fantastic aerospace engineering, spycraft, really quick, Mach 2.5, probably a little bit under that. And the real beauty of it is that they commissioned a company to design a smart system, or essentially a computer. Now, at that time, IBM had computers that were filling up entire rooms. Okay, you got punch cards. You're trying to do, advanced trigonometry to figure out how you're going to land a lunar module on the moon. But Lockheed Martin's like, hey, why don't we use this like really cool, like gyroscopic accelerometer with like a camera on it, have a look at the sky, but make it tiny enough to be inside this airplane. So this thing that kind of looked like a trash can, like R2-D2, used to sit in the back of this aircraft. And there was a viewing port. Now, this system could tell the pilots where they were anywhere in the world at any time, regardless of cloud coverage above them, in under a minute and 10 seconds, and completely autopilot on this plane itself in 1962. So it had a system that was essentially learning a computer, a fast-paced one, very quickly to the elements that are happening outside and the current positioning of stars that were in the celestial sphere. Pretty remarkable. So this thing's taking an input from the outside, right? It's viewing, it's observing, taking this data in and crunching it really quickly to essentially fly an aircraft at fast speed, operate cameras, and make sure that you're headed on the right path. Now, computing at that point was quite remarkable, and the government for some time realized that there's a lot of power in computation outside of just building the, missiles themselves or, new devices to blow stuff up or shoot things. It doesn't matter what it is, or a new ship. How is it that we can analyze the mass amounts of data to better understand where things are headed or what's going to happen before the enemy does? And so what we found is that computations in, aviation and the growth of computers started to advance so drastically that when the internet came out after, it was developed in California, and we started to apply more inputs into these systems outside of just, aeronautical engineering, let's put it into, basic computers with a heck of a lot more data, systems got really, really smart. And so with that, we continued to develop and advance things, and AI came out much, much earlier than we recognize it. When, if we think about OpenAI today, the company's been around for 10 years, but it takes so long for the public to actually see and perceive the value of what's occurring. Like, even in our stance, people are like, what are you talking about data? I can sell this thing. It's worth money, right? It only took 6 years for people to start figuring that out. It's a long process, but when it hits, then people are like, oh yeah, it makes total obvious sense now. So as things continued to develop further and we had better computational power, these devices could crunch and crunch and crunch, and our ability to do statistical analysis became tremendously efficient. And predictive statistical analysis with these things called regression-based models allowed us to build this thing called machine learning, which was the base of essentially artificial intelligence. And if you go a thing deeper, you have neural networks. So to say that if I want to create something artificial and have it map out to how my brain currently fires with its neurons, I need a computer to essentially do that same process mathematically. Now, as these things were in their infancy and these programs were occurring, these processes and algorithms generate this thing, a waste called trash. Okay. Couldn't name it any better. And so dependent on the accuracy of this data set and how quickly it could process vast amounts of information, right, and infer about it, it finds this thing called a local minimum, which is like, what's my most efficient course to determine with the highest amount of predictive, aptitude here to say that I have 90% confidence that, say, the image which this thing is taking in is the number 9, Or this constellation is Ursa Major if I'm flying a plane, right? Because you want to make sure the plane's on the right course. So we've developed so much in these processes and reducing the amount of trash and finding out what these local minimums are as quick as possible. And we've now begun to apply those principles into things that are AI, natural language processing, audio inputs, video analysis, whatever it is, you name it, or essentially the motor functions of a robot. If you want to get its joints to move properly, it's like, how do I know if it's going to be moving in this direction or using a certain amount of energy? It can do those calculations, say, I'll last this long or make this large of a leap, right? If you're Boston Dynamics. Mm-hmm. Now, where does the real efficiency in AI grow? Where's the real growth and beauty and goal of this thing? Because for so long, from the early 60s to where we are now, all we've done is driven this thing into a weaponized technology. And if you mirror that in the commercial space, data has been used to drive consumers to do things they otherwise wouldn't want to do in the first place, or whole behaviors of nations. So when we begin to reverse that, throw it on its head like Clint had said, democratize it, decentralize it, put the power and ownership back in the hands of people, it offers a large amount of tangible benefits for the companies which are, one, using the AI to create new sort of systems to give us outputs so that it creates efficiencies, like Goldman Sachs with their 1.5% in efficiency, right? Or you're at
That's a productivity enhancer.
Yeah, productivity enhancer.
For those of you listening, we talked about this ahead of recording. I asked Alexander, who appointed Goldman to magically come up with 1.5 productivity enhancement through AI. Any comment before we continue?
No, honestly, it's remarkable they can even come up with that, which tells me that the processes of moving whatever the work was something of like one desk to the next. And if you cut off like maybe 30 seconds of that process for people across 10,000 people in your workforce, you probably got like 1.5%. I don't know how they do the calculation.
The market clamors for multipliers, as Clint knows. But I didn't mean to derail, but you said let's assume it's a 1.5 multiplication.
No, it's all good. So for so long, when these systems were designed, whether to be weaponized or to coerce people into doing things, all the power and reliance, chip processing, everything is to say, let's take all this data, lacking the input and context of people from whom we're getting it from, or systems, and let's determine what is best for them. And so with that, you're doing so much guesswork, assuming that, Clint, this is something that you're going to want, right? We can tell by your past, right? You always take a left-hand turn here going to work at this time, right? You're probably going to want to do this or change your tires on this side of the car at some time. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Whatever stupid thing they want to advertise to you. But the difference is, one of those days, you choose to take a right-hand turn. One of those times you choose to take that time off from work because you're not in the proper emotional state that day. Those systems don't know that. And so all they were doing was saying, let's take humans, put them into a box, statistically analyze them and say, this is the minimum. This is how we can make their lives more efficient without any context or input into them being a part of it. Now, if we put the power back of data in the hands of the people, they can give that layer of context. They can actually tell you what they need, when they need it, what the intentions are, how they feel, what they perceive. So it's not about a system on the outside guessing and saying, this is what the world looks like for Clint. Clint defines it himself. And that definition there is the sweet spot. Because these systems which are looking for that efficient local minimum, which is saying, how do we get to that path quickest to make this best for Clint with the least amount of trash in his life? We can now understand the global minimum. Let's take a true measurement of people all over the world using a technology like TARTLE to source this information, run it through our systems to enhance our AI algorithms with something that's truly a proprietary data set, understand what their needs are, and deliver something that is fundamentally robust and beneficial for the human being and its evolution. Our technology has been evolving for the sake of evolving technology. And now with what we've created here, it allows people to be responsible with what they're creating and use it to help evolve themselves. And I think that is the great tide change and turning point for humanity going forward.
So question for you. Thematically, I love what you're saying. Application, real life for an individual. One of the things that's hot right now is talking about health.
Sure.
and the ability. So instead of the healthcare industry selling me things, I can control data and predict things that I may need so that I can have a higher quality of life and healthiness. Is that an application for data that I'm getting this right?
Sure.
In your
So
description?
let me just precurse this thing. I have no PhD. I am no doctor, none of those things. But what I do care is about the health outcomes of human beings. I want people to live a long time. I want them to be healthier. And I want all of these systems to be used properly, like the resources to go to those who are truly in need of those resources. Now, in the healthcare space, and I'm glad you brought up this example, 23andMe was swabbing everybody's mouths, okay, and building up this.
They're collecting a lot of data.
So much data on a genome sequence. And a raw genome file is a couple gigabytes, right? And it's just a lot of information. And so with that, if you're in the biopharmaceutical realm and you have that info, that can help you with drug development or specifically identifying people and what a possible outcome to taking a drug may be, which is an interesting thing, an application of what AI is doing now, right? How will this body react to this, this new chemical structure, right, if ingested without actually having to go through the process of running the trial out of the gate? Now, there's a huge amount of value in that. So 23andMe started selling people's genome sequences to, or, facets of it, information, chunks of it, to biopharma so they could develop drugs, right? Or find people like, you are perfect for a clinical trial for us. Now, they started doing that without consent. So that's an issue. And when people find out, they're like, okay, we gotta stop the ball on that one. We can't be sharing that. That got us a good old slap on the back of the hand. So where do you find the ability to then go unlock that healthcare data, whether it be genome sequences or a very hot one today, which we help a lot of insurance plans with, which is called social determinants of health. And so in the healthcare industry, we've measured everything on when people are already sick in the hospital and when they get out of it and when they return to it. The one thing we've missed is all the habits, behaviors, everything else that leads someone to get to that state of illness and actually end up being in a hospital. And if you can prevent it and catch it early on, there's massive economic cost savings to the hospitals and the plans themselves. And to the people, their savings is that they're healthier people, right? And I think that's a huge benefit to life itself outside of just, money. So these plans, these healthcare plans or hospitals will come to us and say, hey, we have a whole bunch of different members out here, and we're doing a really poor job of engaging these individuals to essentially build a profile on members to understand where our risk sits. They're all out there, but we don't know much about them. We'd all love to think that our healthcare plans and our doctors, know us from soup to nuts and that they're going to tell us the right thing when we walk through the front door. But truly, most of these plans don't even know what language is spoken in the home. So how are you going to ever get to the point to know that, like, what is someone eating? Do they smoke? Is cancer a part of their family history? All those things. And if you can collect it ahead of time, it allows you to then cordon off all your members into these buckets to say, here's the high risk group, here's medium, and here's low, and here's the resources needed for each. So we help them actually collect that information from people, and people are generating all this healthcare data, this healthcare profile, social determinants of health inside their TARTLE data vault. And these plans can come to them and say, hey, these elements about you, we would like to ask you to share those with us, and we'll pay you in return. And now, dependent on what that plan is doing, and many of them are state mandated to collect this information, right, to better serve you, Paul, or you, Clint. They have also a certain amount of money which they can pay to incentivize a member to actually share that information to them or do something, whatever it might be. And some of them are up around $80. So if you think about that context, somebody who has very little or trouble feeding themselves, and, they could be, albeit quite a high risk, whether it be a mental or physical state, you can help financially alleviate their current situations. You can collect data from them so that you can reach back out to them with proper resources. And then you as a plan can intervene at points that prevents them from actually getting to a state of true illness. And that's where the real beauty of this thing starts to happen. That's where the healthcare system doesn't become reactive, but becomes proactive. And studies are starting to come out to show that there's massive economic benefits and also long-term health outcomes for these people that otherwise wasn't possible.
Think about homelessness and mental health, right? So I think about this all the time. Like, hey, if we could print $9 trillion in a matter of 2 months, to essentially do a rolling bank bailout, why can't we print $1 trillion for proper mental health, right?
Yeah. I live in the middle of it. As Clint knows, I'm in an urban area in Dallas in a high rise, and I'm close to an area that's continually seeing more vagrancy, and the mental illness is apparent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so proactive data gathering's got to be at least a nice attempt to try to preemptively solve some of these issues, right? Get to these people before it becomes, too difficult to really turn back, right? Before help is no longer on the way. And so I love the strategy.
Alexander, what other areas? I mean, healthcare jumped out to me, so it's obvious, apparent you put a lot of thought into it. What else really is a highlight for you? Other industries, areas?
Sure.
Really sing to you right now.
Banking and financial services. I'm sure this one will hit it.
Great answer.
Yeah, perfect. Oh, man.
And I promise everyone, this is not teed up. We did not plan on this. We decided to do this raw and organic, and Paul was teeing Alexander up.
Yeah. I don't know what you guys are going to ask me, so I'm just going to respond to it as I get it here. So we all know that information is the edge, right? Whether that comes to finding trends in the market or what's the next stock to pick, or whether it's insider trading, information is the edge. So what happens when you open up the availability to see where markets are going to move, again, intention-based, and start to source data from those people which are using products and services, right? And does it actually fundamentally match up with what is going on in the financial markets? Is someone drumming this up? Is there actually a weakness to it? Is it more marketing than, real tangible value here? So I'll give a couple examples. Banks will come to us and say, hey, we've realized that Western banking regulations don't really work well in developing nations. People don't have things like a labor card or a passport or a driver's license, depending on where they are. But they're working hard. They store money under their mattress, and we want to offer them financial products that can really help spur up economic activity in the area. And also, the bank gets to make its nut off a couple % of whatever the product is. So they'll be like, can you help us start sourcing information from people in, say, geographies of West Africa or the Philippines and help us develop a risk score? So for them, they're like, I don't have any documents on Clint. Clint's in Mozambique. He's got his kid in the United States going to school, which is something that happens all the time. But your kid, Clint, could send you money. But because you are an individual of the nation of Mozambique, you're automatically DQ'd because you're in a high-risk area. But it doesn't mean you're a bad person. So again, the world's starting to change here. It's not going to take just that big macro view. We can go micro because of computational power to assess individual risk, right? Not statewide risk. And so the banks are coming to us and say, hey, we want to do this individual risk and start to measure this on people and offer them directly these products or services that match them depending on the risk level that they're at, and have them, share these documents and data so we can say, okay, our algorithms and AI have said that these are the things this person qualifies for. Now let's open up that level of engagement and offer them those things. So banks will do that, right? And they can do that in a bunch of different areas, right? They're trying to get that edge. But let's go a little bit deeper here. Let's talk about alt data, quantitative hedge funds. Their whole game is measuring delta, right? Mm-hmm. So in their stance, they'll come to us and say, we want to ask her a question or source a piece of data, one specific thing from a vast amount of people. And we want to do it a lot, very frequently. And then we want to see it change. And then we want to go back to those individuals and ask them why it changed. And that right there is the bread and honey for how those individuals get their leading edge with information, is to understand why the delta occurred. So measure a lot of it, get confidence in the measurement, and then ask why that change happened. Now, in the old paradigm, they didn't have the ability to do this, right? You can have the guy sitting out there counting ships or a person going into a factory, any of the sort. But now you can use the whole world as your data workforce to train your models and to give all of that information very proprietary to your traders so that you can have true, legitimate insight into something and say, this is really what we should be acting on, even if it's so contrarian to the rest of the world.
It really is. And what's so exciting, I think, gets lost on people, until they consider it is you started out using the example of phone, but the reality is the Internet of Things has exploded and multiplied beyond even Moore's law about technology.
Sure.
So you are getting data from everywhere.
Correct. So TARTLE has people from 248 specific locales across the world, right? It's more places than countries, which is interesting. I never knew that, right, until it started to happen. And this thing, again, it multiplies on its own. And you've given the world an opportunity when they didn't previously have one. And it's something that's free for them to use, and they can annuitize something and create value that ceased to exist in the first place. It's a narrative that works really, really well. And if you can design the technology to be efficient and simple for them to interact with, everybody's going to use it under the sun. They're going to tell their family members, they're going to tell grandma, and it blows up like Facebook did, right?
So this is where Clint normally talks, the smart guy versus the dumb guy. As we get, because the three of us, I think I could listen to Alexander talk for 3 hours on this stuff, Clint, but we'll kind of wrap up in the next few minutes. My question is, it's called the fat pitch, right?
Sure.
Ted Williams famously waited, look for the fat pitch. Buffett made it more mainstream in investing. From an investor standpoint, what's the fat pitch in data in your mind? Is it the control of it from the individual? Is that the mainframe? Is there something that stands out to you when you're having a short conversation with someone?
Yeah, most definitely. The fat pitch in this entire thing is proprietary data sets. In a gold rush like this, it's not about going to get the gold. The gold in the sense of all these other, there's so much investment in AI. People are like, yeah, let's put it into the mine, right? It's the data centers, it's everything else. But no, really, it's the behaviors that cause people to do the gold mining. It's understanding that. It's the thing that trains people to take that action. That's the real value in this entire thing. You're seeing people invest a ton of money into chips. You're seeing our United States government put ships out in the South China Sea to protect Taiwan because of chip manufacturing over there, because AI is on the rise. The real thing, though, is that it's all well and good to have all those chips and all that stuff, but if you don't have information, if you don't have the fuel that goes into it to make that stuff valuable, you got nothing. So your fattest pitch is going to those places and investing into the things that allow proprietary data to fuel this entire system and the fire that we're seeing right now.
That reminds me of the Gordon Gekko quote in Wall Street when he tells Bud, he says, Bud, the most valuable commodity I know is information.
100%.
And I think that is funny to think that was, when was that movie created? 1982, 1983?
I had that phone. I'm older than Clint. I had the phone.
Paul, I can see you. Blue Horseshoe loves Anacott steel. You know what I mean?
Blue Horseshoe loves Anacott. Wake up, buddy boy. Yeah. I may or may not have had an Armani double-breasted, a la Douglas. Look at Pat Riley coaching the Knicks. So this is absolutely fascinating stuff. And like I said, we could have a 3-hour podcast on it. I think we will be so bold as to ask you to come back in a few weeks or months if you'll regale us with more stories, because you really only hit the tip of the iceberg here.
Yeah.
And I think my mind is just starting to race with applications across so many industry sectors and virtually every part of the planet.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating stuff. How do folks, you got a lot of tremendous thought leadership. Are you active on any Twitter or anything like that?
Yeah, you can find Twitter, LinkedIn, all over the internet. I mean, I publish a ton of material. Like I said, there's probably the 1,000th podcast that I've done. And it affords me time to speak to experts and individuals like yourselves so that I can learn more, not only about me, but the rest of the world.
Well, it's fantastic. I got to tell you, for a guy who hangs his hat in the industrial warehouse space, this stuff's pretty interesting. So I get to talk about a parking lot with 4 walls and a flat roof. So much more exciting. But I will tell you, like one of my wife's family friends, he created some of the first neural networks for on-demand energy.
So cool.
Sold that company, collecting data from warehouses and offices and things like that, which seems quaint now, but it wasn't quaint when they sold it for several $100 million.
No, I mean, just real quick, if you're turning on an AC unit people would flick them all on at the same time. So these systems, this learning network that you're talking about, they were analyzing it and realized, wow, the power draw is insane. And if we do this every day for multiple years straight, our electrical bills are huge. But what if we stagger how we turn these things on? And so that's sort of the beauty in automation and machine learning that we find in those applications, heavy
and
industrial
you don't
ones.
stress the grid, which has been in danger of breaking every day here in Texas for the last week. Clint, any final words here before we sign off for this?
No, Alexander, thank you. As always, love our conversations. Love talking with you about all this. We'll definitely have you back on to talk maybe more about decentralization next time.
Love to.
But yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Everybody check out TARTLE. Check out Alexander on all the different socials. Paul, thank you for being an incredible host.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Great day. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.